Spotlighting Hawaii's leaders.
We want to bring in Governor David E.
Good morning, Mr. Mayor.
Lieutenant Governor, good morning. Thanks so much for joining us. Mayor Derek Kawakami.
Thank you so much, Senator, for being here.
Spotlighting the issues.
Where is the virus right now in our community?
How much is this overall going to cost the state?
How are you responding to the community's concerns? Talk about the level of citations that you guys are writing.
Spotlight Hawaii with Yanji Denise and Ryan Kalei Suji on the digital platforms of the Honolulu Star-Advertiser.
This episode of Spotlight Hawaii is brought to you by Long's Drugs.
Aloha, happy Wednesday. Thank you so much for joining us here on Spotlight Hawaii. I'm Yanji Denise, joined by Ryan Kalei Suji here on the digital platforms of the Honolulu Star-Advertiser. Thanks to those of you who are joining us. And Ryan, today we are diving into the details of an enormous allocation from the legislature to the Department of Hawaiian Home Lands.
Yeah, some calling it historic with that legislation that was passed that would focus on providing housing for the Native Hawaiian community. Joining us this morning is DHHL Deputy to the Chairman, Tyler Gomes. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Great to see you again.
Thanks for having me back. I almost feel a little insecure that I don't have an Emmy behind me right now. Look at the two of you.
Thank you very much. Well, let's jump right in to talk about this landmark legislation that happened and maybe rewind a little bit. Going into the legislative session, when this was announced as one of the priorities by the leadership going into the session and really making it a priority for the legislature to fund DHHL in this way, did the department have any inclination that this type of support was coming this legislative session?
I think going into the legislative session, we definitely had a good deal of interest from our legislators that they wanted to do something for the department. I think the surplus, the $1 billion surplus that resulted in all of this was unexpected. And so as a result, I've said it before, I think the department wasn't necessarily skeptical, but we were shocked that in the end, it panned out to be this massive once in a lifetime sort of infusion of funding that we probably could not have predicted.
So $600 million now, the governor has signed it into law. Let's talk about next steps where the rubber meets the road in terms of allocating the money. Walk us through what's happening right now when it comes to actually distributing these funds.
Sure. So the bill requires that the department produce a strategic plan, which is due to the legislature in December. So that's the first thing we're working on, I think, because we want to establish a solid groundwork of policy considerations that set the path for how the money is going to be spent. So what's actually happening right now is a smaller group of the Hawaiian Homes Commission are working through a permitted interaction group, and they are making those smaller policy considerations to put forth to the full commission. And eventually the full commission will make and adopt the final version of the strategic plan, which will lay out sort of how the money is spent, how it's broken out against the various initiatives that we can spend it on, all of those things.
And when we talk about timeline and looking at who actually is going to be recipients of this, how is that determination made from the long list that you folks have running right now?
Well, one of the primary policy considerations forced the commission to look at demand. And I think I've talked about this here before. 76% of the waitlist currently wants a single family home, right? And so I think using that as the base of the discussion, one of the first policy considerations that the commission made is that the vast majority of this money should be used towards creating housing through single family homes, and maybe a little less of it focused on rentals. And so what that then takes us into is looking at the wait list. We're going to be looking at families who are ready for home ownership. How can we accelerate the pipeline of homes that are sort of in our development horizon, and how can we accelerate all of those things?
Another way this money could be allocated is through a one-time cash payment for folks who don't necessarily want to have an actual physical home, but just want those funds to perhaps, invest in other real estate or spend on rental housing, what have you. How large of an allocation could that be, and who qualifies for that?
Well, under the text of the bill, in theory, all of the money could be used for that. But I think really the Hawaiian Homes Commission has the difficult job of assessing based on what the beneficiaries are saying they want, whether it's better used for the development of housing, acquiring property, or like you're asking, how much of it should be allocated. So I don't have an answer right now how much of it will be dedicated to these smaller individual assistance programs. But I do know that at the very least, the commission is in the framework setting aside a small percentage for this and other creative ideas, because I don't think they want to lock themselves into the possibility of only doing housing development.
And so when, I'm thinking about just the overall timeline and how long you have to kind of get this in order and organize this. I mean, it's a lot of money that needs to be spent and a lot of different components and parts. How are you going to factor through some of these decisions that need to be made in such a condensed timeline?
Well, I think the third policy consideration that the commission was taking a look at was prioritizing things that are already mid-development or further along in our pipeline in order to accelerate them. But also we have the opportunity to consider acquiring not just new land, we can acquire projects that are in development by private developers and then purchasing those units from them. And so these sort of bigger scale expenditures are probably an easier way to expend the money in the time that we do have, and in doing so alleviate the burden against the department for coming up with the resources to plan, design, develop neighborhoods. Acquisitions seem to be an effective way to sort of dig deep into the funds that are available, and doing so in that really short timeline that we have.
Now, let's talk a little bit about the list. We know that it's over 28,000 people, and while $600 million is certainly a lot of money, it will not take care of everyone who is waiting. How much of that waiting list, if you will, do you expect to be able to chip away at with these funds?
I think reasonably, based on what the commission is currently considering, we're looking at as few as 3,000 new units developed. And if we can leverage that money properly and we can continue to access additional state and federal funding sources, as well as leveraging our trust resources, we could hit as many as or up to 6,000 new units, which again isn't the whole wait list, but I think we've been very transparent about that from the beginning, that the need is so great. I think we all know that the $600 million is not going to eliminate the wait list in its entirety.
There has been discussion over, again, going back to this timeline of how long you have to spend this. And we know that there are some policy and structural issues that happened within the bill that may result in a different language in the timeline. Can you explain a little about how long exactly you have legally and what you guys would like to have to get this done?
So I guess to keep it in layman terms so that it's understandable and digestible, the way the bill was written gave us 3 years to expend the funds, but that first year, the way the bill was written was fiscal year 22, which just ended about 27 days ago, which means that first year expired based on the state's fiscal year calendar. And so the way the bill is currently written, we have 2 more fiscal years to expend it. Obviously, we'll be going back to the legislature next year because I think that was an unintended consequence of the bill. And hopefully we see the extension so that we have a full and true 3 years to expend all of that money. So that would take us through, to answer your question of when, I think the way the bill is currently written, we would have until the end of fiscal 24, which would be June 30th, 2024.
So was that just a miscalculation on whomever wrote the bill's part? Is that a simple typo or a bad math? I mean, how did that happen? I'm not going to accuse anyone of being bad at math, but I do think I think it was an oversight, and we had every opportunity to review the bill in as much as the drafters did, and I think it was just an oversight in general. And I think there's a pretty simple fix of making sure the department has the full 3 years that were intended.
Beyond this allocation of funds of $600 million, as you mentioned, it will help, but it by no means will mean the end of this wait list that you folks are tackling, and one of the biggest problems that the department continues to face. Moving forward, what type of support will you be asking of the legislature, and how do you see this continued problem being resolved in the long run?
Well, I think first we need to demonstrate that we can spend the money, right? I think the big question mark here is, are we capable of spending at this volume? And if so, is it worth the legislature continuing to invest in the department? So we know that we have kuleana in terms of executing on this. But every year the department is required to ask for what it believes is sufficient to run all of our operations. So we will be coming back each year with our usual ask, which is in several hundreds of millions of dollars. And there are justifiable expenses there, right? Currently, we plan out in sort of 5-year development timelines because we sort of know that funding is never promised tomorrow. Funding comes in phases. And so we have a much shorter view about how long it's going to take us to plan out. If we can, one, demonstrate that we can spend it, and two, come back to the legislature for additional funds, I think it would enable us to start planning in longer ranges. And I think that would satisfy a lot of people in, that big question that's on everyone's mind, which is how do you end the wait list? We've talked about it here before, but just as a reminder, in our easiest to develop neighborhoods, so Kapolei, for example, which is near a lot of existing infrastructure, the department is still subsidizing, so not charging to the beneficiaries, it is subsidizing $150,000 per unit for sewer, water, electric. I mean, I'm not an expert at math, but if we've got 28,000 houses that we have to build, and we assume that on the most conservative end, we can do every single one of those houses for $150,000, that's somewhere near $4.5 billion just to do the infrastructure for every person on the wait list, right? So we have a general idea of what the need is. The department will always have to keep coming back and asking for more, and that's not just in development. Like I mentioned to you folks, the department also has a repair and maintenance bill that is totaling $200 to $300 million because, as you know, the program's been around for 100 years. We have neighborhoods that are approaching their 70th, 80th, 90th, and for the very few, their 100th years of existence. That's 100-year-old sewer systems. That's 100-year-old water systems. So we have a lot of repair work that we also have to do. And I think sometimes people forget that because money is limited, the department is often tasked with balancing out what are we going to repair this year and what are we going to build new this year and what's going to fall off the list because we just don't have enough. So they can expect to see us back next year asking for more money. And I think what we're trying to demonstrate more than anything is that there is a deep and vast need from this department. And we hope to be able to execute on all of these objectives that we're laying out.
You've worked for the department for a number of years now, and I'm interested to know how you think this session and all the conversations that were had around this large cash infusion has really changed the way that the department can make those negotiations, because you heard a lot of lawmakers coming out really showing a lot of support for this measure and saying that we need to do more for the Native Hawaiian community beyond this money. So how do you think those conversations have changed, with this large cash infusion and the awareness of these issues?
Well, one, I think the department has done a really good job of communicating its challenges. I'm not saying the department was bad at it previously, but I think what we have locked in on in the last 3 years, as long as I've been here, is a really clean and accessible way to talk about what the department's need is, right? And I think being able to say, hey, we need $4.5 billion in, the larger discussion sounds a little obnoxious, but it does quickly get people to focus on, oh, wow, that actually is a really big problem. $25 million a year is not going to solve that. Couple that with the department's continued execution on its development projects over the last 3 years, the creative thinking we've done to try to go out of the box in the product offerings that we put out, in the ways in which we address the needs of our beneficiaries. I think these things are what contributed to this evolved discussion, which previously was, like, as we all acknowledge, was a lot of, DHHL is doing a terrible job, the waitlist is so long, you don't need more money because you can't even do anything with the money you do have. We've evolved into this position of DHHL is doing the most it can with the money that's been allocated to it, but there's so much more it could be doing. And without those opportunities, there would be very little progress. I think we've been able to communicate that. And I think it has resonated not just here in the department and in the state and at the legislative levels. I think the public has been able to pick up on these talking points because they're very easy to communicate. And the public has done such important work in going out and sharing it with others in saying, like, hey, wait, this problem is this big. I know they need $4.5 billion because I heard that guy on Spotlight say it. These are pretty effective ways to get people to communicate it. And I think in simplifying the problem, really, that's how we were able to change the shape of the discussion. But more than that, I think you have some really prominent leaders at the legislative level who were willing to take a stand for Native Hawaiians this year in particular with the surplus. And I don't want to discredit any of their hard work and the list that they had to do, because I think that also reshaped the discussion. It took a little bit of bravery, I think, for a few legislators to come out and say, hey, I know we've been criticizing the department in the past, but maybe we should take a chance on them. That also heavily contributed to that changing tide in the way in which people think about the department. So we're grateful to the finance chair and the Ways and Means chair and the Native Hawaiian caucus and the speaker and the president, Senate president, because without all of them being willing to sort of help us change the narrative, I don't think we would have gotten here.
This may be more of an administrative question, and forgive my, naiveness of asking this, but when you're looking at this list that you have, as well as this $600 million that will be coming to help those who are maybe more at the top of the list, how is that allocated in terms of neighborhoods and communities on each island? So, does it go based on just whoever's at the top of the list, even if there may be a few neighbor island people, and so 2 people on the big island may get it, but 30 people on Oahu will get it? How is that developed in a way that creates some sort of level playing field for those who may not live, say, in these more densely communities like in Kapolei and out on the west side?
That's actually a really great question, and it helps me demystify sort of, like you're saying, the administrative processes by which the department works. So while it is one waiting list, in actuality, beneficiary signs up to be on a wait list specific to an island. So if you're on the waiting list, you're actually on the Hawaii Island waiting list, or you are on the Oahu waiting list. And so when we use this money, obviously we're looking at prioritizing lot development projects based on the timing and position within our pipeline. But we're also trying to think about making sure we're doing projects on each island so that the top of every wait list on each of those islands has the opportunity and access to a project. So one, it's going to come down to making sure that the money is being used equitably across the state. And then 2, the people on the wait list for those islands will be able to apply for and qualify. We do know that one of the challenges, even if you are at the top of the wait list, is whether or not you're able to qualify for financing of the home. And so the bill does allow the department to use some of that funding to provide the services necessary to get people to the point they need to be at in order to qualify for financing. But this is also an opportunity in this discussion here for me to say to those of our beneficiaries who are watching, now is the time to start thinking about your finances. Now, if you want a lot, and we're telling you that lots are going to be coming online in the next 2 to 5 years as a result of this money, now is the time to start thinking smart about your finances. Now is the time to think about how you can improve your credit, increasing your savings so you can come up with a down payment, addressing some of your other needs in your life and balancing them out against the fact that in 2 to 5 years, your name may come up and you want to be ready for that. We know that life presents all kinds of challenges, but we also want to encourage people to think about if you're waiting for a homestead and you've been waiting for a long time, the decision between buying a new car now and potentially qualifying for a home in a couple of years, that's a tough decision you're going to have to make. But we want everyone to be prepared, fully equipped to know that, these things are going to start coming out of the chute really quickly. And we want people to be in a position that they're not left out of the discussion because they didn't have time, resources, to balance those things out. And so if you are someone who is a beneficiary on the wait list and you think you may not have enough saved up for a down payment, or your finances are not in a position where you could qualify for a loan today, you should absolutely reach out to the department and see what resources we have to help hopefully get you to a position that is able to qualify in a few years, right? Reach out to us now.
And this is interesting too, when you bring that up. How do I know, or not me, obviously, I'm not one of the beneficiaries, but how does a beneficiary know where they are on the list and what if they fall in that category that you're talking about?
Well, as far as where they are on the list, you can go to our website, dhhl.hawaii.gov. We regularly publish and update the wait list, so you can see your listing there. As far as knowing whether or not you're going to qualify, that's a little tougher. So I think what's easier to say is, if you think about the homes we recently developed in Kapolei, which were 4 bedrooms and 3 baths at the largest, those homes I think sold for about $385,000, which is one unheard of on the fee simple market for the island of Oahu in the first place. But if you know that today you may have trouble qualifying for financing for a $385,000 mortgage, then perhaps you're the kind of person that should reach out to the department and see what options are available to you to, again, repair your credit, come up with a strategy to create a savings so you have a down payment, all of those things. But that's the range of housing costs that we're talking about. I can't promise that the next homes that come out of this bill will be $385,000 for a 4-bedroom, 3-bath. But if you use it as a reference point, that's a good starting point.
We want to bring in a question from one of our viewers, Tiffany, asking, if the state cannot allocate more funds via legislation, how much funds can be used from commercial property investments income to address the need to place beneficiaries on INA? So beyond just going back to the legislature each year, asking them for funding to help, like they did this past year with a $600 million allocation, what other ways can the department leverage some of its other assets to help increase funding for projects like what we've been talking about this morning?
Mahalo nui for that question. It actually raises a really important point in that beneficiaries don't want us to use the vast majority of our land holdings as commercial investment pieces, right? They would rather see housing developed. And so it's a chicken or egg question. Right now, the lands that we currently lease out for commercial purposes for generating revenue, I think are less than 3% of our total holdings, so it's very small, but we only make $20 to $25 million in a good year pre-pandemic in revenue. And based on the scale of what we're talking about here, you can see that that's not a lot of revenue in terms of building more homes. So if beneficiaries are interested in seeing the department generate more revenue, then the beneficiaries have to be okay with the department accessing and using more land and getting those out to commercial endeavors that are going to create the highest return on investment. That's going to be up to the commission, and they're going to hear from beneficiaries on that. But it is a constant question that is put to this department about whether or not land should be used for these types of purposes. To answer the question of how much, I mean, that's really dependent on how much land we set aside to do this and whether or not we go for the most profitable ways to use this land or we don't. So like I said, currently we're averaging about 20 million in revenue, which is not anything to scoff at, but looking at the scale of the problem we're facing, 28,000 names, that's also not going to solve the wait list overnight.
You talked about getting finances in order. Another important thing that Chair Isla brought up at the bill signing is just contact information so that DHHL knows how to reach folks. What is your message to people who think they may be on the wait list or who may be a beneficiary but haven't had contact with the department for some time?
Please reach out to us and ask for, one, call in to verify your current address. And if it's not current, please request a change of address form. We will mail it to you. And we will get that changed. I think many folks don't realize that if they don't tell us they're moving while they're on the wait list, we generally don't have the ability to figure out where you're going to. So there are many families who haven't heard from the department probably in years, and we'd like to remedy that as soon as possible. So if you're watching today and you're not even sure whether or not we have your current address, just give us a call, check in, find out what we've got on record, and if it doesn't match, we'll happily send the form to you and we'll get that updated because we do want you to be contacted when the time comes for a potential new home.
As we wrap up this morning, just wanted to get some final thoughts. This is an exciting time for the department with this historic funding coming in and the support that seemingly you're getting from the legislature. Your thoughts about just moving forward as a department over the next few years, using this $600 million to help those on the waiting list, but also moving forward with the department as a whole and what you foresee, the department looking forward to as time moves on here.
I think what people maybe don't understand is that government, the key difference between government and say private sector work is that government is very much process oriented, right? You get bogged down in a lot of process. And so the future for the department is going to be dependent on whatever leadership comes in the next 5 months, recognizing that there's a very short timeline here to spend a significant amount of funding, and it's going to be up to whoever's here to understand the processes by which government work is dictated. And I know that sounds like sort of like a really dry government bureaucratic answer, but the reality is you need that sort of expertise in order to sail a smoother sea through getting this done. And I want nothing more than to see this money executed perfectly. I want to see us make a huge dent in the wait list. The legislature can absolutely expect DHHL to come back every year with sizable asks, because we think that is what is owed to the Native Hawaiian people. And if we do this right, I think there is real potential to justify continued large infusions of funding, because I truly do believe the department has the capacity to deliver on this. And I think that this is a unique point in history, right? We just closed out the first 100 years of the program. Call it coincidence, call it fate, call it whatever it is you believe in, but there's something magical about the fact that entering the second 100 years, we're looking at the biggest infusion of cash the department has ever seen, and a turning tide in which the way everyone is talking about what's possible for the Department of Hawaiian Home Lands. And that, to me, is, you know, a really fulfilling legacy to leave behind here going into the next 100 years.
That is a wonderful way to end our conversation this morning. Tyler Gomes from the Department of Hawaiian Home Lands, thank you so much for spending some of your morning with us. We really do appreciate it.
Mahalo nui.
Aloha. Thank you.
Well, Ryan, great to hear from him and all of the developments around that $600 million cash infusion. The department now having a committee to figure out the next steps in terms of allocating that money. He did talk about a little bit of a legislative snafu, if you will, with the actual mechanics of the bill, saying that the legislature had intended to give them 3 years to spend the money, but inadvertently, it seems, gave them only 2. So they will be going back in the next session to try to fix that. But beyond that, you know, we're looking at anywhere from 3,000 to 6,000 people being able to be moved off that list. Still, a list of 28,000 means that this is the first of what they're hoping are many large infusions to really help all of those beneficiaries.
Yeah, really painting a good picture of where we're at with this continued wait list, right? And just getting a better understanding of just how much money is going to be required to get through that list. I mean, you know, here I'm talking about $4 billion as a large sum that will be needed overall, just for infrastructure alone. And knowing that while this $600 million investment by lawmakers was seen as monumental and a historic moment for the department, it really is just a band-aid on a much larger issue about how moving forward the department will continue to get funding through the legislature and other means in order to help to get those who are on this wait list to be able to actually move into their own homes. And also talking about different options that they are considering through this cash infusion, looking for the most productive ways to help as many people as possible.
Yeah, and also that answer to Tiffany's question, thank you for bringing that one in, Tiffany, this idea of where the department should be allocating resources, if they should do more commercial investing, because that can yield dividends. But you know, of course, folks want to see homes built and people moving into homes. So there is that push-pull there. He's saying that in a good year, they're making between $20 and $25 million. If they did more heavy on the commercial investment, perhaps they could make more money. But then, of course, they have to wrestle with the beneficiaries who obviously want homes to move into. Also, some good advice for beneficiaries, just practical advice. Make sure that they have the correct address information for you, contact information, and make sure your financial house is in order, because they could be coming, you know, your name could be coming up, and you want to make sure that you can have the adequate financial resources to support, you know, if you can get off the list.
And we'll also see what changes happen with leadership in the department, with the election season happening and being among us. You know, who knows what the department will look like next year with under new leadership, under a new governor, and new lawmakers within the legislature, and seeing who will commit to maybe the same type of funding that we saw this year, or we could see a completely different makeup of lawmakers. And so a lot of questions surrounding the future of the department. While this is a positive note of this $600 million, there still is also a lot of questions about what's to come with so much happening and riding on this upcoming election.
Yeah, great always to catch up with Tyler. We really appreciate all the knowledge that he brings to us, and we hope to talk to him again in a few months, perhaps after the December deadline for that committee to lay out its plans. Coming up on Monday, school starts, and so on Friday, we've invited a state epidemiologist from the Department of Health, Dr. Sarah Kemble, to join us. DOH recently changed its recommendations when it comes to masking in schools and also quarantining after kids are exposed in the classroom. We're going to talk to her about why they made those changes and what they are anticipating as kids head back to school.
Yeah, also get an update on what's happening with monkeypox and the vaccination process, as more local residents are calling for the ability to get vaccinated, where the department stands on that process, and how they plan to mitigate through all of that. A lot to catch up with her on, and looking forward to that conversation on Friday. Until then, take care, and thanks for tuning in. We'll see you right back here on Friday. Aloha.
Aloha.
This episode of Spotlight Hawaii is brought to you by Long's Drugs.